My name always came before me. At every event, in every headline, in every photograph taken without my permission, the image of the perfect daughter, heir to the Whitmore dynasty, preceded any word I spoke, any feeling I dared to show. It was as if my existence had been sculpted to fit inside a golden frame, unbreakable, unchangeable, unquestionable. From a young age, I learned to smile elegantly, sit with poise, never cry in public, love in silence, and above all, never desire anything outside what was planned for me. And for a time, I played that role with discipline, like a porcelain doll dressed in silk, swallowing her own voice, until he appeared. Without warning, without permission, without even knowing who I was. A man with hands marked by the earth, eyes that didn't waver, words too honest to apologize for themselves. And in that absurd contrast between the pristine world I was raised in and the raw simplicity he carried, I felt something for the first time. Not instant passion. It was deeper, more dangerous. I felt the urge to exist outside the script, to make my own mistakes, to live something that didn't come with a protocol. And in that restrained desire, a crack was born that changed everything. Because once you're seen as a woman, not a symbol, there's no going back to the frame without breaking. He didn't recognize me. And as strange as it sounds, that was like breathing for the first time without that invisible tightness in my chest. We were in the field, me far from the staff that always surrounded me, from the fiancé who sent short messages like orders disguised as affection, from the trained eyes of my family that could spot the slightest hesitation in my smile. I was alone, dressed like an ordinary woman, no subtle makeup, no jewelry, no surname hanging around my neck like an iron collar. And he, with a basket in his arms and dirt up to his wrists, looked at me for a moment without subservience, without awe, without the uncomfortable reverence so many carried. He looked at me as if I were human, truly human. And that, in that almost mundane moment, was more powerful than any speech I'd ever been forced to hear. Because instead of reducing me to a family name, he returned me to a place I didn't even know still existed, a woman who could still be chosen for who she was, not for what she'd inherit. And that destabilized me in a way that all my emotional training, all my image control lessons, and all my years of canned diplomacy couldn't contain. Because there, among sacks of seeds and a gaze that didn't ask permission, something in me trembled, something real. In the days that followed, I kept up appearances. I wore tailored dresses, fulfilled every scheduled commitment, spoke only what was necessary in the polished voice they always expected. But inside, the surface was already cracking. I felt a constant restlessness under my skin, as if my own body were trying to warn me. You saw, you felt, and now you can't pretend anymore. I returned to that field the next day, and the day after, each time with a different excuse. Mistake. Walk, a breather, a pause no one would dare deny. Deep down, I knew I wasn't going for air anymore. I was going for him. For the man who dared to look at me as if I weren't made of titles. And there he was, just as he'd been the first time, bent over the earth with a naturalness that made me envious, as if the world asked no more than 2 honest hands and a life without masks. He didn't say, "You're back." He didn't ask why I was there. He just offered me shade to sit in and an apple picked from the nearest branch. And in that gesture, so simple and so full of unscripted kindness, I realized how much I'd been deprived of humanity my entire life. He spoke slowly, his words full of pauses, like someone who actually thinks before speaking, the exact opposite of the rehearsed speeches I'd heard since childhood. He told me the field had belonged to his grandfather, who planted with the same love he prayed, and that he'd grown up hearing the earth returns everything you give it. including what you try to hide. And there, between a bitten fruit and the damp smell of soil, I let my guard down. I gave him a false name, because I wasn't yet brave enough to be whole, and he didn't question it. He didn't try to pry into who I was, didn't care where I came from, as if he sensed that forcing me to explain would push me back into the world I was trying to escape. And then, without realizing it, I laughed. Not a rehearsed laugh, not the kind with controlled inflection, still eyes, and a posture always ready for a camera. It was a laugh that slipped out unbidden, loud, clumsy, almost childlike. And the next moment I startled myself. I brought my hand to my mouth by reflex, as if I'd done something forbidden. But he looked at me and smiled. A slow, sincere smile, as if that sound, that laugh that escaped me, was more valuable than any jewel I'd ever worn. And in that moment, almost insignificant, I was struck by a certainty. This man would never ask me to be less than I am. And maybe, just maybe, he saw something in me I didn't even know still existed. Not the princess, but the woman. The one who feels, who chooses, who wants, and for the first time in her life, isn't afraid of it. From that day on, I went, back whenever I could. And every time I left, it was as if I left a piece of myself among the trees, in the furrows of the earth, in his eyes. I started marking my days, not by the official events I attended, but by the moments I could steal to see him again. And little by little, I noticed that the version of me walking to that field was different from the one returning. Going, I still carried the weight of my heritage, the codes of posture, the awareness of who I was supposed to be. But coming back, I carried in my hands the memory of conversations that needed no filters, the warmth of gazes that demanded no pretense, the sound of my own laughter still echoing in my chest. It was as if, for a few hours each day, I stopped performing and started truly to live. We didn't touch, not in the beginning. But there was an intimacy between us that surpassed any gesture. It was in the way he noticed my silence, how he paused what he was doing when he sensed I just needed to sit and say nothing. It was in how he offered me the fruits he picked himself, without ceremony, as if saying, "This is all I have, but it's real." And for me, in that moment, that was worth more than any banquet serving dishes I didn't even like. With him, there was no protocol. If I tripped, he laughed before helping me up. If the wind tousled my hair, he didn't try to fix it. He just looked as if he saw beauty even in what was imperfect. And I, who'd learned to hide every imperfection with surgical precision, began to want to be imperfect more often, just to keep being seen that way. But while my soul expanded in this new territory of freedom, the world I knew started showing signs of unrest. My fiancé, the man chosen by families, contracts, and conveniences, began calling more often, showing up unannounced, asking too many questions with that polite tone that masked control disguised as care. I realized my absences were starting to draw attention. My excuses were repeating too much. My smiles were tighter. And somehow, the castle was beginning to notice that the princess was wandering off, or worse, finding herself. That's when the fear set in. Fear of losing the little freedom I'd gained. Fear of someone finding out. Fear that he'd be dragged into my world without knowing what it meant. But the greatest fear, the one that pierced me most, was another. What if I could never go back to being the same? What if, after everything I'd lived with him, with that man without a surname, without a suit, without a castle, the rest of my life within gilded walls became unbearable, and maybe that fear was the answer I didn't want to face. The answer came before I was ready to put it into words. It came in the form of absence. One day I arrived at the field, and he wasn't there. I waited. The sun crossed half the sky, and there was no sign of him. The silence, once our accomplice, began to weigh as if saying, "Don't count on the eternity of what's free." On the second day, I returned earlier, more anxious, my heart pounding with a restlessness that made me realize it was too late to deny I needed him, not out of neediness, not out of fantasy, but because with him I recognized myself, and without him the world became a narrow place, tailor-made to suffocate me. When he finally appeared on the third day, his clothes, dirty from work, his face more serious than ever, I knew something had changed. He didn't kiss me. He didn't hug me. He just sat beside me and stayed silent. And in that silence, I knew. Someone had come looking for him. He didn't accuse me. He didn't push me away. He just told me what he'd learned. A man in a suit, arrogant, reeking of power, had been asking about him. Said he had an interest in clarifying certain unwanted approaches with an important woman. And there, without needing to finish the sentence, my blood ran cold. My fiancé, or someone sent by him. It was the first time the real world invaded the refuge we'd built. And it was also the first time I realized that if I stayed, he'd pay for it. Not with words, not with warnings, with real consequences. I wanted to scream. I wanted to promise I'd fix everything, that no one would touch him, that I'd protect him with everything I was. But the brutal truth silenced me. I couldn't protect anyone while I was still chained to the life I pretended to control. And then, for the first time, he asked who I was. Not with anger, not with suspicion, but with pain. And I, with a dry throat, my eyes fixed on the ground, finally said my real name. I told him who my father was, who my fiancé was, the name of the house I represented, and everything I should have been from the start. He didn't stand. He didn't pull away. He just took a deep breath, as if trying to keep his body in place while the world inside him crumbled. Then he looked at me with a sadness so dignified it broke me, and he said, "Then now you need to decide if you'll live as they expect or as you feel." That night I returned home in silence. I walked through the gilded corridors with a tightness in my chest. I sat before the mirror and stared at myself like looking at a stranger. The perfect makeup, the immaculate hair, the serene face, everything in place except me. And there, in that sterile reflection, I knew the time for indecision was over. It was no longer about a forbidden love. It was about me, about who I was willing to become, about which life I'd have the courage to live, even if it meant abandoning everything. The next morning, everything seemed the same, but I wasn't. The tea was served in the same china. The maid smiled with the same distance as always. The words in the house's corridors echoed with the same theatrical tone of importance given to things that don't matter. But inside me, there was a rupture, a different, denser silence that didn't ask for comfort. It asked for courage. Every gesture of mine was more deliberate. I saw what I'd once accepted, the control, the performance, the hands that had molded me since birth, as if I were a display piece, not someone who breathes. When I looked at my fiancé that afternoon, sitting at the table with my father and other allies with heavy surnames, I realized for the first time that he didn't know me. He never had. He loved the idea of me, what I represented, the educated, smiling, well-groomed woman with measured responses and impeccable presence. But who I truly was, he never cared to know. And now, even I didn't recognize myself in the woman everyone applauded. The days that followed were an increasingly unbearable charade. The field, once so close, now felt unreachable. Not because I couldn't go, but because I knew if I did, I'd put that man at risk again. So I started writing, words scribbled in secret in a notebook I kept locked in the bottom of a drawer. I wrote to him, to myself, to the part of me screaming behind my eyes. I wrote like someone opening a trap door in their chest, sentences like, I can't stand smiling without feeling any more. I don't want to be the image. I am more. I am someone else. I am whole. It was my way of not going mad, because my body attended receptions, meetings, commitments, but my soul was trapped in that notebook, and every written word was a step toward the door I still didn't have the courage to cross. It was my mother who noticed first. Not that. She knew exactly what was happening. She'd never dare ask directly. But she saw in my eyes something she might have seen in her own years ago. A subtle unease, a weight on my shoulders that vacations or rest couldn't fix. A thirst for choice, a hunger for voice. One ordinary night, while helping me choose a dress for yet another public appearance, she paused, looked at me sideways, and said, almost in a whisper, "If you have to go, go whole. Don't look back like I did." And then she continued as if she'd said nothing, as if that sentence hadn't torn the ground from under my feet. For the first time, I understood she'd had a life before becoming the wife of. That maybe she, too, had loved someone who wasn't allowed. And in that moment, something in me solidified, not as impulse, but as decision. I didn't want to be the continuation of her story. I wanted to write my own. That night, I opened the notebook, wrote the final page, and closed it with the firmness of someone who already knew what to do. It was no longer a question of whether I'd flee, but when. Because I'd already fled, inside. The rest was just a matter of time. I didn't choose the day. It chose me. It came with the bitter taste of yet another meeting where they spoke about me as if I weren't in the room. A strategic gathering of families, partners, advisors. They discussed our image, our union, our contribution to the country's stability. Each sentence spoken with that suffocating solemnity only the elite can muster. I was there, seated in an impeccable dress, hands folded in my lap, face impassive, the real doll in the display case. But inside my chest ached, literally ached. A dull pain, a pressure, as if something were trying to escape my body and tear the dress along with it. When my fiancé referred to me as the most reliable pillar of this new generation of leadership, I knew. I knew with the same clarity as knowing when something dies. There, in front of everyone, I realized there was no going back. My staying wasn't sacrifice anymore. It was self-destruction. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on my bedroom floor, notebook in my lap, and reread everything I'd written. Each sentence was a step, each paragraph a piece of the bridge leading me away from that gilded prison. It was like reading the story of a woman who screamed until she was heard by herself. I didn't pack a suitcase. I took little. A coat, some hidden cash, a letter for my mother. In the letter there was no resentment, only gratitude for her giving me, even in silence, permission to choose. I left before the sun rose, and with every door I passed, I left a role behind. The ideal daughter, the strategic fiancée, the obedient heiress. When I stepped onto the street, the air was different, colder, truer. For the first time, the silence around me didn't suffocate. It liberated. I walked without looking around, without thinking of who'd wake and find me gone. I no longer belonged to them, and my destination was clear. I went to the field. I didn't know if he'd be there, if he'd forgiven me, if he still wanted me. But it wasn't about that. It was about me, about showing him and the world that I'd chosen. When I saw him, my heart nearly stopped. He was facing away, cleaning a tool, his arms steady, his body bent as it was the first time. And suddenly everything in me quieted. He turned, saw me, and said nothing. He just dropped everything, walked to me slowly, and when he reached me, touched my face, as if still doubting it was real. I said only, "I'm no longer a princess of anything, but if you still want, I can be just me, whole." He hugged me as if he'd been waiting for that moment his entire life, and maybe he had. In that instant, the world I knew dissolved, and in its ruins, another was born. Ours. The first days were silent, not for lack of words, but because there was so much inside, us still seeking form. We were touching each other for the first time outside the veil of secrecy. Now, we were two whole beings before one another, without hiding places, without disguises. I slept in a small room with simple sheets and windows that creaked in the wind. I woke to the smell of earth and coffee burning in an improvised kitchen. There were no maids, no schedule, no tailored dresses on hangers. And yet, or maybe because of it, I felt more alive than ever. I started learning small things always done by others. Cutting an apple, sewing a button, folding my own clothes. He taught me without laughing at my inexperience. He just showed me with patience and eyes full of tenderness how to live outside the hands that shaped me. And in those everyday gestures, the love between us stopped being an escape and became a choice. But freedom, of course, has a cost. It didn't take long for them to find out where I was. The calls began, the messages, the attempts at control disguised as concern. They offered return, guarantees, a new start within the same old rules. They even sent a lawyer dressed as a diplomat, speaking on behalf of the family, saying they understood the rebellion, but it was time to restore order. I listened with the calm of someone who no longer belongs. And when he finally asked what I wanted, I answered without hesitation. I want to no longer be anyone's property. The man closed his briefcase with a sigh, like someone who doesn't know how to handle answers that don't come with numbers or agreements. He left as he came, unable to take anything from me. Still, the shadow of it all lingered over us for weeks. Jonah, always steady and silent, began to withdraw. He didn't say it, but I saw the fear in his eyes. Fear of not being enough. Fear that one day I'd miss the glamour, the luxury, the weight of the name I'd left behind. We started arguing. Small things. The salt in the food, the time I spent alone in town. But it wasn't about that. It was about him trying to understand if he was just my temporary refuge, and me trying to convince him and myself that there was no going back, that what we were building with our hands was truer than any golden castle. Until one night, without warning, my mother appeared, not as an emissary, not as someone sent by my father, but as a woman. She arrived with a small suitcase and tired eyes, like someone who'd cried all they had to cry before crossing the road. She walked in, without permission, looked at me and said, "I didn't come to take you back. I came to see if you're happy." I hugged that woman like I never had. For the first time, not as a daughter, but as an equal. She stayed 3 days. She didn't ask for details. She just watched, helped in the kitchen, listened to my story, touched Jonah's hands with respect. Before leaving, she said, "If I'd had your courage, my life would have been different. But at least now, I can sleep in peace knowing you had yours." And she left with teary eyes, leaving behind the blessing I'd waited a lifetime to receive. That night, Jonah and I said nothing. We just lay together, hands entwined, hearts at rest. For the first time, without doubts, without shadows, without fear. Life after that didn't become a fairy tale. There was no spectacular ending or applause. But there was peace, and that was the greatest revolution. In the months that followed, our routine took root. We woke early, shared tasks, made small, true plans. Things that seemed insignificant to the world I came from, but carried the immense weight of choice. We loved each other between harvests, walks, and spontaneous laughter. There was silence, yes. There were hard days, of course. But everything was lived without theater. And that absence of masks was what nourished me most. For the first time, my existence wasn't a performance. It was presence. From time to time, My name still appeared in the news, like a scandal that wouldn't fade, a wound the family tried to cover with talk of internal conflict and voluntary spiritual retreat. But no one dared come here. It was as if they feared seeing me for real, or feared recognizing that what they called flight was freedom. One day, I heard my fiancé had married another, in an event surrounded by cameras and billion-dollar rings. I saw one photo. She wore a dress nearly identical to the one they'd chosen for me months earlier, and I smiled. Not out of mockery, but relief. That life, which had been my sentence for so long, now belonged to another name, and that was fine. Let her have it. I no longer belonged to it. I started writing, not out of obligation but impulse, notebooks filled with memories, thoughts, unsent letters, poems born in the pauses of the day. Jonah read everything slowly, always at the end of the night, with his feet over mine and his breathing telling me the world could be small and still vast. It was he who said the words I wrote weren't just mine, that other women needed to hear them too. Others like me, raised to smile prettily and swallow everything they truly felt. And little by little, without haste, with fear and courage, sharing the same space, I started sharing my texts, first with neighbors, then with people from outside. And so, slowly, I found a new way to exist, not as a princess, but as a voice. 1. Day. I returned to the city where it all began, not to go back, but to see with new eyes. I walked the streets where I was once revered. Now, I was just another person, and that gave me a peace I never thought I'd feel. I passed the front of my family's old mansion. It was intact, but I felt no longing, just gratitude for having left in time. Today, I live in a simple wooden house with wide windows and books everywhere. Jonah plants, teaches village children, builds with his hands what I build with words. At night we sit on the porch and talk as if time didn't exist. And sometimes in the silence that accompanies us, I remember who I was and smile, not out of nostalgia, but honor, because it was that girl trapped in a perfect dress who had the courage to flee. And it was she who brought me here. There's no throne more powerful than the one we build within ourselves. Today I'm no princess of anything, and maybe that's why I feel more real than I ever have. I learned that freedom isn't loud. It moves like a river within, silent and certain. I love a man who never tried to possess me, only welcomed me. I live a life without spotlights, but with sun, the smell of earth, sincere words, and hands that touch me with care. I never had to flee again, because now where I am, I'm whole, and where I'm whole is the only place I belong.